February 9th, 1962, Queens, New York. Outside St. John's Cemetery, over 2,000 people stood in the freezing cold, dressed in black. Inside the chapel, the most powerful crime bosses in America gathered to bury the man who had invented modern organized crime, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. But this wasn't just a funeral. It was a trap. 12 gunmen loyal to Vito Genovese were hidden in that crowd, weapons concealed beneath their overcoats, waiting for one signal. When Carlo Gambino, the most powerful mob boss in New York, stepped up to deliver the eulogy, they would open fire in front of 2,000 witnesses, in front of every major crime family in the country. It would be the most audacious assassination in Mafia history. But there was one problem. Bumpy Johnson already knew about it, and what he did in the next 90 minutes didn't just save Gambino's life. It changed the balance of power between Harlem and the Italian mob forever. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson outsmarted the 5 families without firing a single shot. To understand what happened on February 9th, 1962, you need to understand who Lucky Luciano was. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, Lucky Luciano came to America as a child and rose through the ranks of New York's criminal underworld with ruthless intelligence. In the 1930s, Luciano did something no one had ever done before. He ended the blood feuds between rival gangs by creating the Commission, a council of 5 families that would divide territory, settle disputes, and run organized crime like a business. He turned chaos into empire. But in 1936, federal prosecutors convicted him on forced prostitution charges and sent him to prison. During World War II, Luciano cut a deal with the U.S. government. He'd use his connections to protect the New York waterfront from Nazi saboteurs in exchange for early release. The government agreed, but instead of freedom, they deported him to Italy in 1946. Luciano spent the rest of his life in exile, watching his empire from across the ocean, still respected, still feared, but never able to return. On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano collapsed at Naples International Airport and died of a heart attack. He was 64 years old. The Italian government agreed to return his body to the United States for burial, a rare honor for a deported criminal. His funeral was scheduled for February 9th in Queens, and every major figure in organized crime would be there. Carlo Gambino, boss of the most powerful family in New York, was chosen to deliver the eulogy. It was a public acknowledgement. Gambino was now the unofficial boss of bosses, the man who would carry Luciano's legacy forward. But not everyone was happy about that. Vito Genovese was sitting in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, serving 15 years for drug trafficking. But prison walls didn't stop Genovese from running his family. He still issued orders. He still controlled soldiers on the outside, and he still believed he, not Carlo Gambino, should have been named Luciano's successor. Genovese had been one of Luciano's top men in the 1930s. When Luciano went to prison, Genovese expected to take over. But Luciano had favored Frank Costello instead, and Genovese spent years seething in Costello's shadow. By 1957, Genovese had finally orchestrated Costello's retirement through an attempted assassination that left Costello wounded but alive. Genovese thought he'd won, but then came 1959 and the federal drug case that sent him to prison. The man behind his conviction? Many believed it was Carlo Gambino, working with federal prosecutors to eliminate his rival. Now, in 1962, Genovese was locked up, powerless, while Gambino stood at the center of the underworld, about to be crowned in front of everyone at Luciano's funeral. Genovese couldn't let that happen, so he made a decision. If he couldn't rule the commission, he'd burn it down, starting with Carlo Gambino. January 18th, 1962, 3 weeks before the funeral. Bumpy Johnson was sitting in his office above Small's Paradise nightclub on 135th Street in Harlem when one of his street captains walked in. "Boss, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." "Who?" "Won't give his name, but he's Italian, and he's scared." Bumpy nodded. "Send him in." The man who walked into Bumpy's office was thin, early 30s, wearing a cheap coat over an expensive suit. Bumpy recognized him immediately. Vincent Vinicius Calabrese, a low-level soldier in the Genovese family who ran collections in East Harlem. 3 years earlier, Vinny had been caught in a police raid on a numbers operation. If the cops had searched him, they would have found $12,000 in cash, enough to send him away for years. But Bumpy had been there that night, and Bumpy had told the cops, "He's with me." The cops let Vinny walk. Vinny had owed Bumpy his freedom ever since. Now he was here to pay that debt. Vinny sat down, hands shaking. "Mr. Johnson, I don't know if I should be here." "But you are," Bumpy said calmly. "So talk." Vinny took a deep breath. "There's a hit on Gambino at Luciano's funeral." Bumpy didn't react, didn't blink, just waited. "Genovese gave the order from inside," Vinny continued. 12 shooters. They're gonna hide in the crowd at the chapel. When Gambino gets up to speak, they're supposed to open fire." "In front of 2,000 people?" Bumpy asked. "That's the point. It's supposed to look like chaos, like a power struggle. The families will turn on each other. Genovese's people will fill the vacuum." "And you're telling me this why?" Vinny looked Bumpy in the eye. "Because if Gambino dies, New York goes to war, and Harlem will be the battlefield. Your people will get caught in the crossfire. I owe you my life, Mr. Johnson. I'm not gonna let that happen." Bumpy studied Vinny for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the table. "There's 5,000 in there. Take your family. Leave New York tonight. Go to Florida, California, I don't care. But don't come back for at least 6 months." "Mr. Johnson, You just saved a lot of lives, Vinny. Maybe even your own. Now go." Vinny took the envelope and left. Bumpy sat alone in his office, thinking. He could warn Gambino, make a phone call, pass along the intel, let the Italians handle it themselves. But that would make Bumpy look weak, like he needed the mob's protection, like he was a snitch. No, Bumpy Johnson didn't warn people. He handled problems, and he had 3 weeks to handle this one. Most men would have panicked, called in favors, hired more guns, maybe tried to stop the funeral altogether. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. He understood something fundamental about power. The man who controls information controls everything. Genovese's shooters thought they had the element of surprise. They thought no one knew about the hit. But Bumpy knew, and that gave him the advantage. Over the next 3 weeks, Bumpy made a series of moves so subtle, so precise, that no one, not even his closest associates, understood what he was doing until it was over. Move 1. Infiltration. Bumpy contacted a man named Marcus Smooth Henderson, who ran a small funeral services company in Harlem. "I need you to put some of your people on a job," Bumpy said. "What kind of job?" "Luciano's funeral. I need drivers, pallbearers, ushers, people who can blend in but keep their eyes open." Smooth understood immediately. "How many?" "8, and I need them ready to move if things go bad." Within a week, Smooth had placed 8 of Bumpy's most trusted men inside the funeral operation, dressed as staff, invisible to everyone except Bumpy. Years moved to misdirection. Bumpy reached out to an old contact, Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest who'd served in Harlem for 20 years and owed Bumpy for keeping his church safe during the riots of the 1940s. "Father, I need a favor, a big one." "Anything, Bumpy. I need you at St. John's Cemetery on February 9th. I need you near the chapel entrance, and if I give you a signal, I need you to cause a distraction." "What kind of distraction?" "The kind that makes everyone look away for 10 seconds. Father O'Brien didn't ask questions. He just nodded. Me, move 3, the swap. This was the most dangerous part. Genovese's 12 shooters would be sitting in assigned seats, close enough to Gambino to guarantee a kill, but spread out enough to avoid suspicion. Bumpy needed to know exactly where those seats were, so he paid a visit to the funeral home's administrative office. Not personally. That would have drawn too much attention. Instead, he sent a woman named Claudette, one of Madame Stephanie St. Clair's most elegant operatives. Claudette walked into the funeral director's office, wearing a black dress, pearls, and a story about being Luciano's distant cousin, who needed to confirm her family's seating arrangements. The director, eager to please someone connected to the legendary Luciano, showed her the seating chart. Claudette memorized it in 30 seconds. By that evening, Bumpy had a hand-drawn map of the entire chapel, every seat, every aisle, every exit, and he knew exactly where Genovese's men would be sitting. Now came the final move. Move 4, the reversal. 2 days before the funeral, Bumpy's people made the swap. Late at night, when the chapel was empty, they switched the seat markers. The 12 seats reserved for Genovese's shooters were reassigned to harmless mourners, elderly widows, distant Luciano relatives, low-level associates with no connection to the hit. And the shooters? They would be redirected to seats in the back, far from Gambino, scattered and useless. By the time Genovese's men arrived on February 9th, the trap they'd spent weeks planning would be turned against them, and they'd never even know it. The morning of the funeral was bitterly cold. By 9 a.m., over 2,000 people had gathered outside St. John's Cemetery in Queens. Reporters lined the streets, cameras flashing. FBI agents stood on rooftops with binoculars, documenting every face. And inside the chapel, the most powerful criminals in America took their seats. Carlo Gambino arrived at 9:45 a.m., flanked by 6 bodyguards. He wore a black suit, black tie, and dark sunglasses that hid his eyes, but not his tension. Gambino knew something was wrong. He could feel it. Funerals were dangerous. Too many rivals in one place, too many opportunities for violence. But this was Lucky Luciano's funeral. Not attending would have been an insult to the man who'd built the commission. So Gambino came, and he prayed he'd leave alive. At 10:15 a.m., the service began. The chapel was packed, standing room only. Bumpy Johnson was not inside. He stood outside, near the parking lot, wearing a long black coat and a fedora pulled low over his face. To anyone watching, he looked like just another mourner paying his respects from a distance. But Bumpy's eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd. He spotted them immediately. 12 men, all arriving separately, all wearing nearly identical black overcoats. They moved through the crowd with purpose, heading toward the chapel entrance. Genovese's shooters, right on schedule. Bumpy watched as they entered the chapel, showed their invitations to the ushers, and were directed to their seats. Only those seats weren't the ones they expected. One by one, the shooters realized they'd been placed in the back rows. Far from Gambino, separated from each other, surrounded by strangers. Confusion rippled through their ranks, but they couldn't cause a scene. Not here, not now. So they sat down and waited, hoping for an opportunity that would never come. Inside, the eulogy began. Carlo Gambino stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of faces. Lucky Luciano was more than a boss, Gambino said, his voice steady. He was a visionary. He saw a world where we didn't fight each other. We worked together. He built the commission to end the wars that had killed so many of our brothers. Gambino paused, and because of him, we stand here today, united. At that moment, one of Genovese's men in the back row made eye contact with another across the aisle. They both knew the plan had failed. They were too far away, too exposed. If they opened fire now, they'd kill innocent mourners and accomplish nothing. Worse, they'd be cut down before they could escape. The hit was off. Outside, Bumpy Johnson watched as the service concluded without incident. Gambino finished his speech. The mourners filed out. The 12 shooters left separately, faces tight with frustration and fear. They had failed, and they knew Genovese would not forgive failure. But here's what they didn't know. Bumpy Johnson had saved their lives too, because if those 12 men had tried to shoot Carlo Gambino, Gambino's bodyguards would have returned fire instantly. In a chapel packed with 2,000 people, the body count would have been catastrophic. Dozens dead, families destroyed, and Harlem, caught in the middle of the mob war that followed, would have burned. Bumpy had stopped that, not with violence, with strategy. 3 days later, Bumpy received a message. A black Cadillac would pick him up at 8 p.m. on the corner of 125th and Lenox. No names, no details, just an invitation. Bumpy knew who it was from. At 8:00 p.m., the Cadillac arrived. Bumpy got in. The driver didn't speak. They drove for 30 minutes south through Manhattan, across the Brooklyn Bridge, into the heart of Gambino territory. The car stopped outside a small Italian restaurant on Mulberry Street, closed for the night, but the lights were on inside. Bumpy walked in. Carlo Gambino was sitting alone at a corner table, 2 untouched glasses of wine in front of him. "Mr. Johnson," Gambino said, gesturing to the empty chair. "Sit." Bumpy sat. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Gambino leaned forward. "I know what you did." Bumpy said nothing. "I don't know how you knew," Gambino continued. "I don't know how you stopped it, but I know you did." He picked up one of the wine glasses and slid it across the table. "You could have let me die. Could have let Genovese's men kill me and watched my family tear itself apart. That would have been good for you. Less competition, more chaos for you to exploit. But you didn't." Gambino raised his glass. "Why?" Bumpy finally spoke. "Because Harlem doesn't need your war. My people don't need to die because you and Genovese can't get along." Gambino nodded slowly. "You're smarter than most of the men I work with." He took a sip of wine. "From now on, Harlem is yours. My family won't interfere with your operations. We won't push into your territory. We won't try to buy your people." "And in return?" Bumpy asked. "In return, you stay out of Brooklyn, out of the Bronx, out of Staten Island. And if someone doesn't respect that arrangement?" Gambino's expression hardened. "Then they'll answer to me." Bumpy picked up his glass. "One more thing." "Yes? If Genovese tries something like this again, you let me know. I'll handle it my way." Gambino smiled. A rare sight for a man known for his stone face. Deal. They drank in silence. When Bumpy left that restaurant, he'd secured something no black man in New York had ever had before. Respect from the 5 families. Not fear, not tolerance. Respect. The 12 shooters who'd failed to kill Gambino didn't live long. Within a month, most of them had disappeared. Some were found in the Hudson River. Others were never found at all. Vito Genovese, still in prison, realized too late that someone had betrayed him. But he never found out who, and he never discovered that Bumpy Johnson had been the one pulling the strings. Genovese died in prison in 1969, powerless and forgotten. Carlo Gambino, on the other hand, ruled New York's underworld for another 14 years, becoming the most powerful mob boss in American history. And he never forgot what Bumpy Johnson had done for him. When Bumpy died in 1968, Gambino sent a wreath to his funeral, a gesture that shocked everyone who saw it. A mafia boss honoring a black gangster. It was unprecedented. But those who knew the truth understood. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just saved Gambino's life, he'd saved the peace. February 9th, 1962. A day that should have ended in blood. A day that should have started a war. Instead, it became the day Bumpy Johnson proved that real power doesn't come from violence. It comes from intelligence, strategy, and the courage to act when no one else will. Lucky Luciano was buried that day, but the system he'd created, the commission, the balance of power, survived because one man stood in the shadows and refused to let it fall. That man was Bumpy Johnson, and his legacy? It's still felt today. Every time you hear about organized crime operating like a business, you're hearing Lucky Luciano's vision. But every time you hear about someone outsmarting the system, protecting their community, and winning without firing a shot, that's Bumpy Johnson. I really want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. This story has reached people from every corner of the globe, and I'd love to hear from you. Let's build this community together. And if this story showed you a side of history you've never seen before, hit that subscribe button. There are more untold stories coming, stories of strategy, survival, and the people who changed the game without anyone knowing. See you in the next one.